There we go. And so yes, it's been exciting to see the work that Muskan and Sarah have been doing, and then you're going to be presenting this to the evidence working group at our next meeting. But in between, if there's any feedback from this group and from Marinus and Marian, it'd be fantastic to have that ahead of the meeting as well. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Fantastic. So how do we go? Do we want to start maybe with Muskan on the repository, which is work that you'll be familiar with, in the sense that we've been talking and have this repository right from the beginning of the Evidence for Impact working group, but after quite a bit of activity, it kind of went pretty quiet. And so the idea is, how do we how do we first of all review the repository, its purpose, and so on and so forth, and that's the work that Muskan has been doing, and then propose ways of strengthening it, making it more user-friendly and accessible, etc. Does that summarize the work you've been doing? So Muskan, over to you.
Thank you, Florence. Hello, everyone. So as Florence has already mentioned, the project itself initially was just reviewing the content and format of the repository to see what were the facilitating factors in terms of use and what could be the constricting factors. We started this process first by just looking at the repository as it was, making a list of which of these studies have been completed, who has inputted what information of all the questions that were asked, how many people are actually answering all those questions, or is it just that people are mentioning titles? So the first part was just generally looking at the repository, understanding the current status quo, post which we then sent out emails to a number of research practitioners who are members of the working group to speak with them, to understand from their perspective what would be the barriers to the use of the repository and what would be the incentives. So the first part of the project was primarily focused on just identifying those barriers and incentives. What we figured out so far from those conversations are, in terms of the barriers, in certain cases there might be reluctance to share information about ongoing projects because the work might not be at a stage where people are comfortable sharing about it to other people that they're working on it. Sometimes this hesitancy could also be coming in from concerns of their work being appropriated. The second piece was, and which second part, which was mentioned more often in conversations, was just general lack of awareness about where the repository is. Even if people were aware that there's a repository, access to the repository or knowing how to access it was severely limited. The platform itself was difficult in navigating, and that ultimately became a significant barrier. And after a point in time, even for people who were regularly going and checking the repository, they realized that new studies weren't being added. So when that was happening, it just became a cycle of nobody then interacting with the repository. Plus, the other thing was, whenever new studies were added, if at all any were being added, there is no information to know other than to go at the repository and see that new information has been added. These were some of the barriers that people mentioned. In terms of the incentives that we were told, one was opportunity to collaborate and network. And I don't think I'll dive deep into this point because this is something which has been discussed in the previous conversations with the working group as well. Florence has often spoken about the need for collaboration and networking, which I think everybody who we had conversations with also agreed is an important thing. The second piece was the opportunity to publish studies, in the sense that the repository can provide a platform for users to publish their work, whether it's preprints, working papers, or finalized research. This might essentially be an additional incentive for people who are looking for folks to collaborate with and work with for the project. The second piece was, this is something which was mentioned by a couple of people. Now, whether or not this is operationally feasible is a different conversation. But one thing which was mentioned as an incentive was call for funding. The repository can host calls for research proposals and connect researchers with potential funders if funders were aware that there's a repository where planned studies as well as ongoing studies are mentioned. And if there's a interest overlap, then perhaps there could be an opportunity to secure funding for their work. The fourth piece was if there was an opportunity to get formal recognition of their contribution to the repository as researchers. It was mentioned that things like sending automated emails that recognize contribution, which academics especially and researchers could include in their CVs, because often when people are reviewing the peer reviews which happen for that, typically not many times is it that the person gets paid, but they get formal recognition. So that's something which came up in our conversations. The next thing was generally they felt that having something already in the research world, more registration protocols are upcoming. So there is an opportunity to figure out the ongoing systems where they are being encouraged to increase transparency. So this, from a culture point of view, is an upcoming culture in the research world itself. So to sort of leverage that change. And then last piece was just sharing the work for advocacy practitioners in particular. It's about sharing their work and increasing outreach. So these were some of the incentives that came up. The next part about the conversation that we had once we had a conversation with people was to then figure out, okay, now what will the user journey of somebody who's working with the repository look like? So we figured out things which were related to access, navigation, and taxonomy. And the second part of it was just what processes will be involved in the maintenance and upkeep of the repository itself. So right now the repository is in the function of an Excel sheet. The recommendation after the conversations with people is that we probably can move away from a spreadsheet to a different interface, which is easier to navigate. I will, after this conversation, share the user journey also. I want to be mindful of time, so I'm not going into the depth of that right now. What would be helpful is probably just sharing what were the features that we've been thinking would be helpful to have on the repository web interface. So there are certain must-have features that we've identified. One is the project submission form being on that link itself. There being a home page which has menus and navigation paths. So rather than directly going to an Excel spreadsheet, we're going to a website-like interface which we can navigate from. A project, there would be a page that has all the project lists on it, and then people can click on the project title to know more details about that particular project, rather than having everything at once in a long spreadsheet. Then there were certain good to have features that we thought. One was a user profile, and this is one of those things that we wanted to discuss on call today also. User profile as well as something which is at the nexus of researcher profiles and practitioner profiles also could also be an opportunity for people to connect, because they get more information about what is this person's interest area and research specific to alternative care. So adding those profiles, adding personalized alerts systems in the repository itself, where people can set up alerts for certain keywords. And whenever contributions are made, depending on those keywords, they will get an alert via email that something of your interest might have been uploaded if you'd like to check. Then the second thing was to have a feature where once the study has been completed, we wanted to figure out a way for the study to get moved out of this repository, because we want this to be a catalog of ongoing and planned studies. So in order to do that, there were two things that we thought. One was to send depending upon the planned end date, an email can go out to the contributor who has uploaded the study, reminding them that the planned date is upcoming. Couple of reminders can be sent. If even after 3 months that's not been removed, then we can make an assumption that the study has been completed and remove it. So these were just some of the features. I have not touched upon everything. I'll share all of this via email as well. What I think we can do now is to Okay, am I audible? I just realized I'm not sure I'm on call.
I wasn't audible anymore, but yes, you are totally.
Oh, sorry, because I'm not, it says it Zoom error code something, and now I'm not able to see anybody.
Oh no,
You're back.
we
You're
heard
back.
you very well, Muskan.
Okay. All right. So that's where we are. What we were hoping to hear from you, but on to feedback primarily on two things. One is, do you feel that there is an incentive or a barrier that we haven't yet identified to the usage of the repository? That's one part that we're looking for feedback for. And the second part is one of the major barriers was lack of awareness and people actually not accessing it, which is also in part due to outreach. So how do we increase outreach and let people know about the repository, encourage the community as people who co-own this, rather than this being held by by just one person or a group of people? Can this be co-owned by the community? And what do we need to do to ensure that that co-ownership is developed, even in terms of organic outreach without it having to be specifically planned for? So this is one thing that we haven't yet been able to figure out, and that's one area where if y'all can share what your thoughts are, how can we increase the outreach and co-ownership of this product by every member of the working group?
Thank you, Muskan. And you will be sharing, Muskan's done some fantastic, not only the work on the spreadsheet, but also kind of mapping of user journey and so on, which is really helpful to understand some of the path, some of the incentives, some of the challenges.
I will in fact share the link right now.
Perfect.
Let me just check share settings. I often end up sharing links without realizing that the share settings are not open, and then I have to redo it. So I'll just do it, anyone with a link, just a second. I'm sharing the link to the folder that has all the work which has been done, so that depending upon who is at what comfort level, you could choose what you would like to read. Where's the chat?
And just to remind, I mean, I know you're going to be familiar with this, but the part, a big aim of this is, of course, how do we strengthen our community's ability to understand and know what research is being planned, what's being undertaken, to connect with one another, to learn from each other, and not reduce duplication as well. And that's part of the step to also enable us to go to the next one, which understanding where our evidence base is, and of course addressing the gaps, which is the other objective as well of this group. Thank you, Muskan.
Okay.
So you're not being put totally on the spot right now. I know you'll need time to look at this and mull over what Muskan is asking, but if you have any first kind of thoughts or reflection on a question. Jen, please.
Yeah, thank you. This all sounds amazing. I don't have any big ideas to add, but I'm just wondering if, because when BCN publishes the newsletter that many of us receive with the with the most recent studies, sort of advertising them, could there be something there where there's I mean, that's a good place to advertise the repository, and I'm not sure what the mechanism is for getting those studies onto that newsletter, but I'm wondering if there's a connection point there where either the person could be prompted to add them, or whoever's adding them to the BCN newsletter could also add them to the repository at that point.
That's a really good question. One of the challenges with this repository, and this part of what Muskan looked at, is who is this repository for? So on the one hand, do we actually only make it available for members of the evidence working group? Do we make it available for other researchers who might be interested? And what are the pros and cons? And I think one of the challenge, if you make it more open, is that it may kind of deter organization or researchers who feel, as Muskan said, who feel that they're not really at a stage to share, or are worried their work might be used inappropriately. So that's one of the drawbacks of doing something like that, like having it On the other hand, you know, if we limit it as well to the working group, that might be challenging because we might be missing some really critical pieces of research and initiatives that that simply are not connected yet. I don't know what other things. Muskan, what are your thoughts?
No, I agree with you, Florence. I do feel that given that we wanted to limit this to the members of the working group for all the reasons that you've mentioned, sharing it via the newsletter may not serve that purpose. That being said, I also feel that there is value in there being an automated system where some updates are shared. One, in terms of just, okay, these repository studies were added, all of those things. But second, also if people are willing to share testimonials about this is how I use the repository and I found it useful in XYZ ways. When something like that happens, that's also going to increase the level of trust in the community itself, that all right, somebody's been using it, this is how it's worked for them, let me also give it a shot. Because oftentimes something can be useful but life happens and we tend to deprioritize it. So to get that organic outreach, I feel that if we add something like that, that would be helpful. Whether it's the Better Care newsletter or should we have a different platform where something like that is shared, I think that's definitely something to be figured out.
I mean, it could be done through the whole of the Transforming Children's Care, which
Yes.
brings over 900 actors. So it still is within the community. They still have signed up. So there's still a sense of, I guess, a sense of community, which of respect of one another, etc. That might be one way. But I do like the idea, Jen. I mean, I think this question which this wariness of publishing about something that's not finished. People are very wary of doing that for a bunch of reasons. So we want them to be comfortable as well, to be saying that they're among their peers and that it's a delicate balance, isn't it? Because I mean, yeah, and from the top of my head is, why would you? Of course, the reality, even at the programmatic level, people are not sharing what they're doing because they're like, oh my God, that's my tools, and they're going to be using my tools. Like, as a community, it's not just the researchers that are kind of worried about, or people are going to judge our work.
I think Mary just raised her hand, if I'm not mistaken. I'm sorry if I'm calling it. I just saw the hand raise, so I thought it was.
I haven't seen Mary's hand.
Okay, then I must be mistaken.
And then in terms of the platform, I mean, we completely acknowledge part of the problem is the link to that repository and to the Google form that links. You know, the collaborative platform is not very good actually at keeping resources easily accessible. You know, so for people to click and they're quickly able to know where to go for this. So that's one of the challenges of keeping it to the community, but we could think about how to do this, you know, much more easily, by either having right at the top on the description of the evidence working group, and then there is a button which kind of links you to immediately to the repository, and then immediately to the submit to the repository. Or, I mean, Margot is the expert on these things, but there might be. And then whether it's published somewhere else, then we would need to think, could this be an incentive for driving people to the evidence working group, encouraging them to join where they can access it? So it could be that the newsletter, for example, talk about the repository and say there's this repository as part of the community. If you're interested in learning what research is ongoing or sharing and blah, 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 join the evidence working group or something like that. Potentially. It's really changing a culture in our community. And it's also drawing more researchers to this community so that we grow as well, the not just the numbers, but the range of researchers who recognize that this is a really big field, and that's a field that actually has a lot of potential, particularly as we work to ensure that we get more funding driven to this and more clarity around the research priorities. So if that makes sense, maybe Muskan, you shared the folder. Maybe we'll do an email where you
I
can
will.
kind of summarize the different elements of the work you've done ahead of the evidence working group meeting, so
Yes.
that you can get feedback. First of all, from this group, or the two groups that have converged, and the co-chairs, and then through the evidence working group next meeting, so we can really dig in and get get input from others as well on that.
That makes a lot of sense. I will send that email.
Great. So that was, if you're okay to move on, that was the first part of the work, and we're extremely grateful to Muskan to have been working on this, because this is a really key part of the objectives, but we've been stalling, we've not been really advancing, and I think with the work that Muskan has done, we really are going to be bringing life again to this really important part of the goals. And then we've also been extremely lucky to have Sarah with support as well, from a little funding from Changing the Way We Care, to help us actually think through the other elements of this. So we've been talking about the planned or ongoing research, and Sarah's been looking at the published literature, and how do we start to have a better sense of our evidence. And so over to you, Sarah.
Hi. Quick question. When is that evidence working group meeting?
I think it's the 6th of December, but
Yes.
is that right? 6th of December.
On a Wednesday?
Is it a Wednesday?
Probably.
Yes, it's a Wednesday. I have it on the calendar in front of me.
And we'll remind people. Yes, it is.
Okay.
In fact, we need to send. I don't think we've sent the Zoom link, Margot. Have we sent the Zoom link? Maybe I haven't registered.
No, I don't think so.
Oh,
I was
yes.
just checking my diary.
Yeah, so we need
Okay,
to
we'll
actually
that
do
today.
a reminder to everybody, and then pull together a little bit of the agenda and also the Zoom link.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so so I'm going to be talking about the proposal for a BCN literature review repository, which I was working on. So this is near and dear to my heart because I'm an academic researcher, and so basically I wrote up an idea for something that I thought would be most useful for my work. So it was really exciting and really fun to get to work on this. What I came up with is basically a dynamic living web page on the BCN website called the Evidence for Impact Hub. And I believe that it should kind of be separated into two different chunks, because if we did all the evidence on children's care for everything, it'll be a little overwhelming. But Roby, it's okay. He's trying to get me to fix his phone. My phone. It's not his phone. He thinks it's his phone. So the first bucket is to focus on child outcomes. So what I'm going to be talking about today is ideas around this Evidence for Impact Hub focused on child outcomes. And there's a second bucket, which is equally important, which is the evidence we have on systems. So that's like if we're thinking of, outcomes versus output, maybe outcomes is a little more about child outcomes, output is a little more systems. So that's a kind of a topic for a future day. So we're going to put a pin in that. So my vision is that this Evidence for Impact Hub website would be centered around essentially a systematic review that we would call the State of the Evidence report, a State of the Evidence report. And we would develop that by doing a systematic review of peer-reviewed and gray literature. And then in the process of creating that report, we would be tagging and labeling and categorizing the studies that we come across. And then we would be able to input all of those studies into a mega map or an evidence map or a gap map. That's all different things that people call them. So for example, an example of a gap map or an evidence map, I'll share my screen if this works. Can you see it? So this is an example of an evidence map or a mega map on all interventions about child well-being. So the different circles demonstrate how much evidence is out there on a topic. And then if you're interested, for example, on looking at interventions that improve mental health and psychosocial improvement via, if I can, it's kind of via school vouchers, you can see that there's this one study that falls into that. Or if you're interested in looking at the evidence that exists about immunization coverage via, let's say, via community health interventions, you can see this like dozen or 24 studies here, and you can click on them and find them, and you can sort them and filter them. And this, I think this software here that they use to make this little thing is potentially open source, or it's something that is, you know, achievable. The Digital Solution Foundry Epi Reviewer. So it's like, it's achievable. It's within, I think it's within reach. So this would be the dynamic version of it. And then at the same time, we would have a static version, which would be in report format. So let me stop sharing. And the report, so the report would synthesize in a narrative form what evidence we have and what evidence we lack. So you could read it and it would tell you, you know, we have a lot of evidence on, you know, on foster care in low and middle income countries, but we do not have as much evidence about interventions to improve foster care. Most of the evidence that we have is simply comparing children who are in foster care or who are in families. And most of the evidence shows that, you know, children in foster care tend to have lower educational outcomes versus children in their care of their biological parents, but we have less evidence about psychosocial, like it's written out in a narrative format that you can read and understand, and it tells you, it's a synthesis. It tells you what evidence is strong and what evidence is contradictory or what's mixed. And I made a little kind of a lamb. That's right, it's a lamb. And this is kind of a mock-up of what I imagine it looking like. So if this was like the Better Care Network website, it would say, this is the Evidence for Impact Hub. And we have, if you click here, you can read the 2025 State of the Evidence on Child Outcomes. And if you want to explore it in the dynamic mega map form, you can click here and do that. And so what we could do then is every 5 years or so, we could go back and do another search of anything that was newly published in the last 5 years and update our State of the Evidence report and publish a new one every 5 years or so. I also suggest a rhinoceros. I also suggest publishing this kind of report, the systematic review report, in a peer-reviewed journal, alongside making it a PDF gray literature thing that's easily accessible on the BCM website, because certain academic funders really value peer-reviewed journals. And so if we're able to cite it from a peer-reviewed journal, that'll help us, you know, leverage additional funding opportunities as researchers. Okay, so I'll take a pause. Does anyone have any questions about that so far?
Pretty groovy, isn't it?
And so this is my suggestion. I'll just keep using this document as my outline, and then for the December meeting, I'll make it into a PowerPoint. But this is my proposal for how we can make this a reality, like in achievable steps. So I think the first step is just to work amongst the Evidence for Impact working groups to kind of validate this plan, get people's feedback on it. And then the second phase is that we pilot this like systematic review process, simply using the Better Care Network library instead of using every peer-reviewed study that's ever existed. And so we can pick like just one category in the Better Care Network library, like whether it's kinship care or guardianship. And this process will help us test out how we label and categorize the studies, and because usually giving it a shot and practicing labeling them, you realize, oh, we should actually change the definition of this label a little bit, et cetera, et cetera. And then after we have done that pilot, then we would do a systematic scoping review of all of the peer-reviewed literature that's out there. And it would be a heavy lift. It would take some time, but we would do it once and then we would be done. And then from then on, we would never have to do it again, because then from then on, we would say, okay, now we're only going to look at the evidence that's been published since 2025, because we already looked at everything from before 2025. And this is just an example of some software that can help you create, help you do systematic reviews. It's kind of in the weeds. And then finally, we would create this mega map, which I showed you what it looks like to do a mega map. And then the last thing would be that we would draft that report and create that narrative synthesis, because I find that when you're trying to synthesize literature, having the mega map and having the ability to sort and filter studies actually helps you write and think about how you're going to do your synthesis. And then the last phase, when you move on and do it all over again for systems of care instead of child outcomes. Okay. And this is a tricky part, but this is my proposed criteria for how we sort and label studies. So this goes really, this is a lot more into the weeds, but you can see some of the ways that I think that all of the studies should be labeled so that we can sort and filter by these different areas. So for example, these are the 6 categories of child outcomes that I came up with. I think they're actually based on the Child Status Index. Here's the different care settings that everything should be tagged with, different types of interventions that they can be tagged with. And then special themes is adapted from the working group 3 list. So if a study is about moving between care settings, it should be tagged with this. If a study is about care leaving, it should be tagged with this. If the study focuses on child sex and comparing children of different sexes, it should be tagged with this. If it's focused on disability, it should be tagged with this. And then it would also be tagged by child age, region, methodology type. And this is where it gets a little tricky, but I think that we should also rate we should do some sort of a rating for how impactful the study is. And this is where we really need the evidence for impact working group to come together and test this out and discuss it and figure out how to do this. So yeah, this is because rating how impactful a study is tricky and subjective, but we can dive more into that in a minute if you want. And because first I want to show you an example I did. So I kind of just, instead of doing a whole systematic review, I used an article that was published called The African Child in Kinship Care. And I kind of this is kind of what it would sound like if we had this is what the state of the evidence report would sound like. Research about kinship care is often focused on comparing kinship care to other types of care, and it often focuses on school enrollment. There's mixed evidence on whether children in kinship care institutions experience more maltreatment. Some studies say one thing and some studies say the other thing. And then this is the back end of what we have. So this is all the studies that were in there. There's these 24 studies. I put them into this matrix. And so, for example, you have this study from 2015 called Child Fostering in Senegal. It focused on the child outcome of child protection and education. It compared care situations, and it also investigated the characteristics of care settings, and it also compared by child sex, and it also explained reasons for entering or leaving the care setting, in this case, kinship care. And then I gave it some ratings about how impactful the study is. So I said it was actionable. Yes, it was relevant to low resource contexts. It was rigorous, but it did not have the participation of children with lived experience. And then this, if you this is a map I made of all the studies on African kinship care, where you can see that we have a lot of studies about education and a lot fewer studies about psychosocial outcomes, if you look up and down this column. And then in terms of, we have no intervention research about kinship care. There's no studies that I could find that looked at interventions for improving child outcomes in the context of kinship care. We didn't have any studies that looked at kinship care, the intersection of migration and kinship care. We didn't have any studies that looked at child disability. So you can immediately see where the gaps are and where the strengths are. Yes, and then once we get there, right now, this study only looks at the number of studies in each category, but in a future iteration, it would also take into account the impactfulness of each study. So there'll be some way to pull that together. Yeah, so this is kind of like a quick and dirty version of what a gap map or a mega map would look like, but it would be a lot prettier in the end. So yeah, I'll stop there. That's kind of a lot of information. Does anyone have any questions, or is there something that you would be interested in diving more in depth into?
I should just start by saying this is such incredible work, and
Yeah.
it's both ambitious, but it's also like so exciting because it gives us steps by which we can start to envisage actually this. And of course, one of the it is, as Sarah said, will be a significant, particularly when we get to the stage of doing the systematic reviews, even just on outcome. It's a significant amount of work, but it does mean, as she pointed out, that this is a piece of work that you do, and then the lift is much less once we've done it. It's about updating and so on. And of course, what it will enable us to do is to ensure that we don't have to do this 25 times as each organization and so on think about, okay, so where is the evidence on this? And then they hire a consultant to go in, a researcher to do a review. And then you're like, okay, so you're investing in one piece of review. So it actually, while it's a huge investment in time, resource, expertise, it actually ends up becoming a much more sustainable way for us to have a sense of where our evidence is and where our gaps are. And so it's very, very concrete. So really appreciate that.
And the fun thing about it too is that even if in the future some organization needs to do a mapping on a very niche topic that's not covered in here, they can use this list of studies. They don't, even if we didn't tag or categorize for that topic, they already have a list of 100 studies that they know are all of the studies about children's care. And so they don't have to do the crazy process of sorting through 10,000 articles, you know?
Exactly. Any thoughts?
So something I wanted to highlight, Florence, because this is something that came up in our last discussion, is I was really thinking a lot about this idea of evidence for impact. And you kept talking about how like involving government stakeholders was an important aspect of impact. And I think that I realized that we were having we were conceptualizing the idea of impact differently, because I think that that's really true about the impact of an individual study and how it impacts the situation in which it was carried out. But I think that what this evidence hub needs to highlight is what potential for future impact a study has in its application to other contexts. And so that's why in the end I decided to take out that part about government participation, because I think that what's important isn't how impactful was this study when it was done, but the important thing is how can this study be applied in to somebody who is trying to learn about best practices, or how can this study, how applicable is this study to future work, you know, because, and when a study is very rigorous, that makes it useful for informing other work. If a study is done well, it makes it useful. If a study is very relevant to low resource contexts. If it has a large sample size, so it's a little bit more generalizable. And also, if it does have the participation of children, that also makes it more impactful, because that's an aspect of what makes a study valid, because we know that, you know, it was done, it's not missing that whole that whole aspect of children's own experiences.
Yeah.
So
No, that's a very good point. I was thinking more as well in terms of the system level impact, where in the same way that you're talking about children's participation, involving your key stakeholders, which governments are in the system research, I would think would be a similar impact in terms of, or similar. It serves the similar purpose than, for example, you just say with children around the validity of it. But no, I totally get your point. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so we could have that as a criteria in the systems version.
I mean, you know, others would need to clearly think that this is but I think just even having this discussion is really helpful.
Right, exactly.
I'm seeing good comments, Jen and Mary. You think this is exciting?
It's really very, very, very exciting. And of course, it's a whole lot of work. So it is another question that we could raise, that what about artificial intelligence? Would it help us to do some collection of materials? But I can imagine child participation. So I'm just wondering how can we, because then obviously the next stage would be also to do that at country level for those publications and research that are not published in English. But again, this would be a huge amount of work for.
But I think we've agreed, but I think we've got to, like a lot of the time, we've got to agree on how do we move step by step, because otherwise
no, I agree. No, I'm just thinking on how could we somehow get some help besides funding, because it's not only the funding, it's actually the technical part, because this is very, very time consuming and extremely complex to find the resources.
What I really liked when Sarah presented on this was this question, for example, of the state of the evidence, and this question of, because it was this question that this could actually be exciting for researchers to actually do this, and to be, you know, it's work for them, it's building their expertise and their profile around their knowledge. It can get published into articles. So there's a whole bunch of incentives. It doesn't mean that necessarily the money is obviously there to do this, but it creates incentives where researchers might be excited about this, and where we might actually be able to access resources, you know, from, you know, academic funding bodies that might be interested in this, because researchers are interested in it, and it's seen as a very valid and important field of inquiry. So it kind of creates its own circle. It doesn't mean it's easy, but but there would certainly need to be an investment even to kind of move on those first steps. And let's say the beginning of a systematic review, as we discussed, you know, of outcome. I mean, that requires, but even just now with the conversation with Marinus and Marianne around that piece they're doing on deinstitutionalization, we're looking at that. We're looking at, okay, even if you take, you know, those terms and you're going to do a systematic review about that, what would it take? And so, you know, one way or the other.
I can imagine, Florence, that there could be groups of researchers who are focusing on a specific area.
Yeah.
Who have already, I mean, collected tons of information, and then utilizing those could be also another way forward.
Totally. Like, for example, the work that Lauren Sher did on violence against children in alternative care, where she actually found relatively little. But what has happened since she did that study, we could update that. She might be interested in updating. I know I was talking to World Childhood. This is, of course, a very big issue. And they may be, you know, exactly as you said, there may be some areas, both researchers and donors, that are particularly interested in that area. that would be, yeah, totally.
I also want to point out that I was involved in a systematic review this year where someone from that we definitely have to connect with this group. It was not food for education, but it was the one of the USAID food security initiatives. I can't remember what it's called. And for some reason that particular individual was really interested in the measurement of early childhood development in I know you guys skipped the ad. She was really interested in early childhood development in LMIC, and she somehow got funding to do a really rigorous systematic review of the measurement of ECD. And she put together a team of like a dozen of us, and we all split it up, and we all like I had 20 or 30 studies that I reviewed and I ranked, and I labeled them by how rigorously they were done. And then she was in charge of synthesizing, and we had this whole team of people doing this together. And it worked out. I think it worked pretty well. But it's still not even finished. And we started around this time last year. So yeah, but we should definitely draw from them and the learnings for how they operationalize that big project.
It would definitely be incremental, and particularly when we look at this evidence map. I mean, even I remember looking at it a few years ago, and there was relatively little in there. And I think, and this is UNICEF in with all of their might, and I think that realistically these things grow as we find these actors who are interested in particular. And but wouldn't it would be so fantastic if we could actually take that really strategic approach to our evidence mapping, so that instead of having this very piecemeal ad hoc initiative whenever we need to make the case on, or we need a research that needs to back our initiative or something, we're like, oh yeah, there's 2 pieces of research that somehow do this, but that we're actually able to do this in a more rigorous way. And that really is the aim of this evidence working group. So very excited about this, excited about bringing this to the evidence working group and discussing this further, excited about bringing this to donors, because remember, one of our big aim as well for the evidence working group is to encourage as well the donor community, and not just the donor that supports care, although they are a very important actor, but also a broader community of donors that support academic research, to see this as a priority, and to be willing to invest their funding more strategically into research on care. Any other comments? Any other thoughts? Moskan, I hope you're still with us. I think you are. So you dropped a little bit.
I'm here, but with some struggles from my laptop. That being said, I do have one thought, but I'm generally someone who likes to go through things before and then share. So I will share a longer list via email after I read the document in depth. But one of the things that's coming to me in terms of finding that area of collaboration between both the projects, I feel the categorization which has been done for this one is very helpful, and perhaps we could adopt a similar categorization for the repository as well, because in its current form we had taken the previous questionnaire and those themes which were mentioned there to categorize. But if ultimately there could, at some point, if there could be a part where if people are putting ongoing and planned studies on the repository, and when they are completed, if there's an automated process via the same tagging, that automatically gets moved to this web interface of the already completed studies, I think that could be a good workflow. I know it's a little complicated, but ultimately both could then feed traction into each other if the taxonomy itself is similar.
That sounds very logical to me. Yeah. So what would we say is Sarah, you're going to be sharing this as well with the group. And then if you have opportunities to review this, to think through, as Muskan said, some of it is a lot of information, and have further ideas, inputs for Sarah and Muskan to provide that before evidence working group meeting. Then at the evidence working group meeting, we'll have an opportunity to have others feeding into this. But I'm really excited to bring this to the next conversation and to be thinking about how the evidence working group can really look at next year as an opportunity to, you know, dig deeper into this and move forward these agendas. They're not a one-year agenda, as Sarah pointed out, even with that one study, but there are strategic ways of achieving our goals by taking on bites at a time. And I think that, and through that, creating greater consensus around what we understand as evidence for impact, getting greater clarity of where our evidence is or isn't, and how we're going to achieve that, and also greater understanding of who we need around the table, who's not, to enable us to do that, because we are still a tiny group of actors with a very big mandate. So thank you so much, Muskan and Sarah. Really appreciate your work on this. It's been really exciting, and it really shows we need this expertise in our group to move forward, because we often have, I know I do, you know, I have these ideas, oh, we should do this, we should do that, but then you're like, okay, so how do we make it happen? That's where the expertise, you know, in research is absolutely critical to think strategically. So really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And we'll share the recording with the other members of the group who couldn't make it. But please take the time to look at this and also give your feedback, and also make sure you're here on the next evidence working group. And if you know colleagues who should be there and may forget about it, we'll send out the invitation again with the link, but please reach out to them so we'll make sure we've got a good turnout. Thank you all. Thanks a lot, Sarah. Take care. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.